Hey everyone, I hope you're all doing well. This week we're going to finish up with Chapter 4. We'll have two videos. This video will talk about what are called the fallacies of minimal support, and then in the next video, which will be a little bit shorter, we'll talk about the fallacies of unacceptability. So we combine those with the fallacies of illusory support we talked about last week. We'll have a pretty solid list of just sort of generalized inductive probative fallacies. And then following that in Chapter 5, we'll begin looking at specific kinds of inductive probative arguments. Alright, let's get started. Alright, so the fallacies of minimal support differ a little bit from what we talked about last time, the fallacies of illusory support. With the fallacies of minimal support, the premises supply some amount of support for the conclusion, just not very much. So they do have some evidentiary weight, they have a little bit of evidentiary worth, but they don't have very much evidentiary worth, and they seem as if they have way more than they really do. Again, there's sort of a trick here. The trick is sort of thinking that something that's only sort of minimally relevant or minimally important matters way more than it really does. We'll have 8 of these that we go through today. One of them we're not really going to talk much about, but I'll just mention it at the end of the video. 7 that we'll focus on. So let's begin. So the first kind of fallacy of minimal support we're going to look at is what are called the ad hominem arguments. There are 2 different kinds of these that we'll talk about, the abusive ad hominem and the circumstantial. They both have the same general structure, they just differ in terms of how they're precisely operating. Both of them, however, involve attacking the person who makes an argument rather than attacking the argument itself. That's sort of the definitive characteristic that makes something an ad hominem argument. So this is different than a guilt by association. In guilt by association, you attack an idea or some sort of position. In an ad hominem argument, you're not attacking an idea or position directly, you're indirectly attacking it by attacking the person who is making the argument right now. So in an abusive ad hominem, you attack the person by suggesting that they're a bad person, in effect. So the person who made an argument is a bad person, and so therefore the argument that they've made is a bad argument and should be rejected. And that's a sense which is abusive. It's sort of attacking the sort of moral standing in some sense. It's insulting the other person. So here would be an example of an ad hominem argument. Phil says that we should cut taxes, but Phil kicks puppies, and no one who kicks puppies is someone we should listen to. Now, the possibility of Phil being an unreliable narrator, it is relevant to whether or not we should accept the argument, but pretty minimally. As a general rule, if you can refute an argument, that's always way stronger than attacking the person who made the argument. And in this case, it's pretty tertiary, right? I mean, whether or not Phil does kick dogs, even if we assume that this was true, that doesn't mean that Phil's views about tax cuts aren't worth taking seriously. As a general rule, bad people can make good arguments, and so it's better to look at the argument rather than the person who makes it. Something very similar is true in the case of a circumstantial ad hominem. Here, instead of insulting the person, you instead say that because of some feature of their background, or some feature of their character, you're able to sort of just dismiss what it is that they're saying in this particular juncture, right? So you don't even need to listen to the argument. Usually this has some sort of sense of, well, of course someone like you would say something like that, so I don't really need to take it that seriously. And here would be an example of an argument that commits this fallacy. Of course you say that the federal government should aid people who are affected by forest fires. There's a forest fire burning very near you. So your stance can be dismissed because of some feature of you. It's not an insult exactly, right? It's not saying that the person is a bad person, but just that saying that their claims and their arguments can be dismissed without really looking at them because of sort of features in the person's background. Now there's a complication with both the ad hominem, abusive, and circumstantial arguments that can make some things that look as if they're ad hominems actually be legitimate argumentation. There are some instances where the person or the quality of the person who's making the argument is actually part of the argument itself. A really common example of this is an appeal to authority. If I say, trust me, I'm a doctor, right, take this medicine, my qualifications as a doctor are integrally part of the argument itself. So if I could say, well, but why should we trust you? You're just pushing this drug because you were paid to do so by a pharmaceutical company. That actually seemingly is attacking me, so seemingly it's sort of a circumstantial ad hominem, right? Something in my background means you can dismiss what I say. But in this case, because my argument is so hinges upon my impartiality as a doctor, for example, if I do have a conflict of interest, that actually while it looks like an ad hominem, actually is a legitimate critique of my argument. That kind of argument we're going to call an appeal to authority, and we'll spend a lot of time this semester going through it when we get to chapter 6 in the textbook. The next kind of a fallacy of minimal support that we're going to talk about is called the fallacy of popularity. This is where, in fact, the argument just says that something is true because lots of people think that it's true. Right? The key here, though, is that this has to be an instance where there's no reason to think that sort of the average person or the general person has any sort of special knowledge or expertise about a topic. So here's an example of an argument that would commit this fallacy. Quantum mechanics must be false. I don't know anyone who believes any of that stuff. There, I'm appealing to some belief is false just because lots of people think it's false. In this case, the people that I'm familiar with, people that I know. But there's no reason to think that the average person really has any sort of expertise or qualification to have analyzed whether or not quantum mechanics is likely to be true or false. Right? That would require a pretty specialized skill set that the common person doesn't possess. And so as a result, then, this argument commits the fallacy. The evidence of other people is indeed relevant, that's why this is an illusory support, but it's not worth very much, right? I mean, maybe if all the people I knew happened to be quantum physicists, that would be a different matter. But just the average person's opinion about quantum mechanics, while not irrelevant to whether or not quantum mechanics is true, probably doesn't carry much weight or have much force. We can complicate this, though, if there's a case where the average person kind of does seem as if they know as well as anyone, whereas as trustworthy as anyone on some topic, then you might have an argument that looks as if it's committing the fallacy of popularity, but really isn't. So let's look at an example of that. Everyone that I've talked to says that Fred's is a really good Italian restaurant, so I think I'm going to go try it out. It's probably pretty good. There, the quality of a restaurant seems as if it's something that at least, the average person is at least a reasonable judge on. Maybe he's not as expert as a food critic or something, but even still, if everyone I know says a restaurant's pretty good, that seems as if the sort of thing that people in general have some knowledge about. So that, while it might look as if that argument is committing the fallacy of popularity, it's not doing so. To commit the fallacy of popularity, the argument has to be sort of appealing to the general public, where there's no reason to really think that the general public is sort of competent or qualified to speak on the topic. So the next two fallacies are really closely related. They also, depending on how sort of rigorous someone is being when they make an argument of this sort, they could also be instances of statistical fallacies with arguments from generalizations. So we'll talk about them in that more statistical context later. Right now, we're just going to talk about them in a sort of probative context. So the first that we'll talk about is what's called a hasty generalization. This is any argument that reaches a sort of generalized conclusion. It doesn't have to be about everything, but at least like a lot of instances of something, based on a very limited number of sort of sample instances that the person has familiarity with. So let's look at two examples of this. My iPhone broke after 1 month of owning it. iPhones must be incredibly unreliable phones. Here we've got a hasty generalization. I've only looked at one iPhone and have reached conclusions about the reliability of all of them based on just that one sample. But it's indeed quite possible that I just got unlucky, might have gotten a lemon. Maybe other iPhones are really good, and presumably since there's millions upon millions of iPhones in the world, just looking at one of them isn't really enough to allow me to make any kind of confident statement about what's true of the majority of iPhones or most iPhones. Here would be another example of a hasty generalization. Say I was a news reporter. I spoke with 3 people on the street, and all of them said they were going to vote against Senator so-and-so this semester. Senator so-and-so really seems to be in trouble. Here again, presumably it's an election that contains many thousands at least, if not hundreds of thousands of people voting in it. Just talking to 3 voters, not really enough to sort of make a generalized statement about how many people are likely to vote for the senator or not vote for the senator. There's another fallacy that's really closely connected. It's really just a special case of hasty generalizations called the fallacy of anecdotal evidence. This is where you commit a hasty generalization specifically because you're giving too much weight to your own personal experience. Things we experience firsthand, we tend to take really seriously. Things we sort of hear secondhand or things that don't directly impact us or people that we're familiar with frequently can feel kind of distant and less real. So when you're committing the anecdotal evidence fallacy, you give too much weight to your own individual personal experience. In the case of the 2 examples of the hasty generalization fallacy that we looked at earlier, the first is an example of the anecdotal evidence fallacy as well. My own one bad experience with the iPhone was enough to sort of sour me to the whole brand. I'm giving my own experience too weight. The second really isn't. In the second case, that would the person sort of talking about what they've heard from other people. They're sort of doing a survey of some sort, just doing the survey badly, not talking to enough people. So they're not relying on their own experience or their own feelings about Senator so-and-so. They're relying instead on what they've sort of gathered from, a sort of improperly carried out survey. So next up is what we're going to call the absence of evidence fallacy. Before we go into detail on it, let's just introduce the notion of a burden of proof. You've probably heard this phrase before, but let's just formally define it, make sure we're all on the same page. Okay. So normally, when someone makes a claim, it's sort of on them to prove that the claim is true. And this is especially true if the claim is sort of controversial, if it's sort of an extraordinary or surprising claim, or if it's something that there's widespread disagreement about. If I'm going to advance some position, the burden of proof is on me to establish that conclusion is correct. That's sort of the basic logic of an argument in a very real sense, right? I mean, the whole point of an argument is to give reasons to believe that some conclusion is true. In an argument that commits the absence of evidence fallacy, that burden of proof gets switched. So these are always arguments where someone is trying to defend their own position, and they defend their own position by shifting the burden of proof onto you to prove that their position is wrong, or prove that their position is incorrect. So here would be an example of an argument that commits this fallacy. There is a vast conspiracy afoot to create a New World Order government that will oppress all people. Prove that that's not true. Well, hold on a second. That seems like that's certainly a controversial claim, a extraordinary claim, not necessarily a false one, but a very surprising one, right? This is not something that there's broad-spread agreement on or anything like that. If I'm going to advance such an outlandish claim, such a unexpected, unusual, extraordinary claim, the burden of proof is on me to give you reasons to believe that that's true. The burden of proof isn't on you to disprove my outlandish theory. Right? And so the idea here is if you can't, like off the top of your head, disprove my outlandish theory, well, therefore my outlandish theory must be true. But that seems almost like it's in reverse. I haven't given any reasons to believe that the fact that there is such a massive conspiracy afoot, and the fact that you can't refute it off the top of your head, in and of itself, that doesn't really give very much reason to believe, indeed, that there is such a conspiracy afoot. What makes this a little bit more complicated, and why this is a fallacy of minimal support rather than a fallacy of illusory support, is that if you can seriously attempt to disprove some theory, you make concerted, multiple, serious efforts, and all of your efforts to disprove a theory fail, enough of those does start to kind of sound like a good reason to believe that some theory is true. This happens all the time in science. This is sort of called the confirmation method, right? Where let's say I have a theory, say like Einstein's theory of general relativity. The way that I'll go about trying to establish that we have good reasons to believe that that theory is true is by repeatedly and seriously attempting to disprove it and having all of my efforts fail. The sort of logic is that, like, if I over and over again can't disprove this theory, that does seem to offer us some reason to believe that it's true. Contrast that, though, with the example that I gave of committing the fallacy, right? Here we didn't have any sort of serious effort to actually disprove the theory. I'm sort of just, and the argument was sort of just relying on the fact that off the top of your head, you probably can't, argue against this sort of crazy claim that I'm making. So it does provide some minimal support, the fact that there's no evidence to disprove something, but unless you have multiple serious and repeated efforts to establish that some theory is false and they all fail, just not being able to prove that something is false doesn't give you really much in the way of reasons to believe that it's true. Alright, so the last fallacy of minimal support that we're going to spend a lot of time working on is what's called the slippery slope fallacy. You might be familiar with this one. This one's one of the more famous of the fallacies. This is another fallacy that only occurs in the context of attacking some position, so you would never put slippery slope to make your own argument look better. I suppose maybe you could, but that's never how the term gets used. This is always something that gets used to attack some position. The slippery slope argument sort of suggests that a proposal is going to produce some kind of disastrously bad result, and so because of that bad result, we should not do the proposal, right? We should resist the proposal. But it does this, and in principle, yeah, if a proposal is going to produce a bad result, that would indeed be some reason not to do it. What makes the argument a slippery slope fallacy is that the argument doesn't supply you with sufficient justification to believe that the bad result or the disastrously bad outcome is actually likely to follow from the initial proposal. So here would be an example of a really simple slippery slope fallacy. If we raise taxes, the next thing you know, the economy will collapse. just on its own, I mean, so if the economy collapsed, would that be a bad thing? Sure, yeah, that indeed would be a problem. If the argument gave good reasons to believe that raising taxes is going to lead to the total and complete collapse of the economy, yeah, then this would be a good argument. But just as stated, it doesn't actually justify a link between the proposal and the bad, disastrous consequences. Another example, sort of a scare tactic, right? Like, I bring this thing up, but I'm not justifying how it's actually going to come about as a result of the proposal. A lot of time with slippery slope arguments, it's going to be sort of a series of escalating bad consequences, and maybe at the beginning of the sequence, it'll sound pretty reasonable. It might seem plausible. But by the time you get to the end, again, it's become really implausible, and no work has been done to sort of link all the steps together. So here would be an example of a more extended slippery slope fallacy argument. If we raise taxes, it will cause a downturn in the local economy. A downturn in the local economy could hurt school funding. If school funding decreases, the rate of student dropouts might increase. Next thing you know, there'll be packs of feral children roaming the streets, attacking people. Here we have sort of an escalating series of bad consequences that are going to follow from the original proposal, and these consequences get sort of more and more absurd the farther out you go. There is indeed, it's not a crazy thing to say, you'd like to see a little bit more evidence, but it's not a crazy thing to say, right off the bat at least, that raising taxes might cause a downturn in the local economy. That's plausible. But as you continue to add more and more consequences, it gets less and less plausible. You'd have to do a lot of work to justify and connect all the individual pieces, and that work is not done in the argument, so therefore it's committing the slippery slope fallacy. Alright, that's just about going to do it for us today in this first video. There's one more fallacy of minimal support that the book talks about. This is called the fallacy of equivocation. This fallacy takes place where the meaning of a word changes either within the premises or between the premises and the conclusion. We're not going to focus on this fallacy very much because usually it's either really, really obvious and the argument just sounds like a joke. It's not something you'd be tempted to take that seriously, or it's really, really subtle, and usually there's better ways of sort of characterizing what's going on in the really subtle cases. So it doesn't seem to me as if it's super worth our time to focus on this fallacy of equivocation. We'll do another video to follow up with this one where we finish up with chapter 4 when we look at the fallacies of unacceptability. Alright, that'll do it for now. I'll talk to you later. Bye!